In the Woods Institute, we use a portfolio of different strategies for advancing our twin goals of more interdisciplinary approaches and more solutions-oriented approaches. Some involve funding research, some involve convening dialogues on difficult topics, and some include focusing on the kind of leadership skills that are required in order to deliver on the promises. And we'll hear a little more about the experiences that individuals have had in utilizing and putting into practice the lessons and the resources that we provide. So I'm thrilled to be joined this afternoon by 4 people who are icons of successfully taking advantage of woods resources. First, Mehana Vaughn is an associate professor in the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Management at the University of Hawaii. She's a 2013 graduate of the Emmett Interdisciplinary Program in Environment Resources. She's in environmental social sciences whose work focuses on indigenous and community-based natural resource management. Anja Brandon is the director of plastics policy at Ocean Conservancy. She works to advance science policy solutions at the state and federal level to reduce the use of single-use plastics, hold plastic producers accountable, and support the transition to a circular economy. She earned many degrees, a BS, an MS, and a PhD in environmental science and environmental engineering at Stanford. Julio De Leos, professor of oceans and Earth System Science at Stanford. He's also a senior fellow at the Woods Institute for the Environment and professor by courtesy of biology. And Julio's a leader in disease ecology, health, and the environment. And then finally, Tara Moran is the senior advisor for the California Water Data Consortium. She advances the consortium's goals of accessible and usable data for sustainable water management. And prior to joining the consortium, Tara led the Sustainable Groundwater Program in Water in the West in the Woods Institute. I have a special beginning to this afternoon's session. Mehana has agreed to lead us in a traditional Hawaiian oli.
Thank you.
E aloha no Hawaii ku ne hana, mai ha'e i ka mole o le hua, puka mai ka la i ke komohana me he manua, i ke kaiuli, e malama ulu kukui, kahi kau meke no e ahue, e la hoi ka wa'a i ke ka i ka hoi. A pai ka ina i ke ka i ka hoi. Poi ke o nauna pume hanai. Ani mai na aloha, aloha. Aloha. I would just share that coming from Hawaii and with many of our Indigenous partners as well, we start off by greeting this place and all of you from our ancestors. That's a chant that was written when we were here at Stanford by Native students preparing to welcome our Native partners from First Nations Futures Program, our own people, Maori and Alaskans, coming to meet and greet Namuekma. And it just asks that the work that we do here and the learning that we do here, even as the hills are cold and the mists roll in, that this place, Stanford, which its many torches of knowledge and wisdom, that they continue to give warmth and bring us together around food and help us to go safely home and take the learning home. So we just wanted to aloha and thank you all from something created in our time in these programs here that we're going to talk about today. Aloha nui.
Thank you. So I'm going to give behind a little bit break and start with Anja. And could you just tell us a little bit about your engagement with the Institute and how it shaped your trajectory?
Yeah, absolutely. So the, I guess, keystone program that I participated in at the Woods Institute is called the Rising Environmental Leaders Program, or RELP. And it is essentially a professional development program to build future environmental leaders. So kind of to Saul's point earlier, increasing that supply of environmental leadership that we need to tackle some of these wicked challenges. The program itself, if you're not familiar with it, is a year-long, pretty competitive program. It has a series of workshops, and then it culminates in DC for a boot camp, so a week-long boot camp where you meet a bunch of folks, go to all the fancy places in DC. We went to Congress, we went to different buildings in the White House, and really just the idea of learning how to make your science better for policy and also understanding the premise of science policy. And in terms of how it shaped my career trajectory, I mean, that's pretty easy. It fundamentally changed what I do. I have always been a math and science person. I stuck around here and did a PhD because I really liked the research and knew I was drawn to that, but I didn't know what exactly I wanted to be when I grew up. And I think there's a fundamental challenge of you can't be what you don't see. And there's just not a ton of exposure in some of the hard sciences to opportunities to really drive an impact using your scientific knowledge in other ways. There's a ton of exposure to the academic pathway, which we know is phenomenal and is also not the right fit for everyone. So thinking through what does it look like to go into policy, work in a think tank, work in an advocacy organization. And that's fundamentally what this program does, is it exposes you to those different career pathways and also gives you some of those tangible tools to advance your career there. So through RELP, I heard about this program called the AAAS Fellowship, which is AAAS as in the same people who publish Science, the magazine. It takes people straight out of their PhD and brings them to Capitol Hill to go work in DC for a year. I did that fellowship right after my PhD. I worked for Senator Jeff Merkley from the great state of Oregon. You have to say that every time.
It's true, though.
Absolutely true. I also live there now, so I can say it wholeheartedly. And I absolutely fell in love with science policy and using the engineering and technical background I had to advance and have an impact in a fundamentally different way, but use the same critical thinking and strategy skills that we develop as scientists and as thinkers to actually deliver something. And after my fellowship, I got connected to Ocean Conservancy, which is the environmental nonprofit where I work, met them through the fellowship. So really all of the work I've done since then, including passing kind of fundamental game-changing state laws, really does trace its roots back to RELP.
Perfect. Julio, several people have mentioned the Environmental Venture Program grant. Julio is the expert in figuring out how to do creative things with them. Can you tell us a little more about what makes those grants special and how you've used them?
Absolutely. So the Environmental Venture Program has been absolutely transformational in my experience here at Stanford. It's created basically the foundation for research work that is transdisciplinary by its own nature, and in academic world where I often have heard that we have to protect the integrity of the scientific disciplines. This basically encouragement of opening up to crossing boundaries between disciplines has allowed us to find new solutions to problems that have been afflicted humanity for a long time. So this component of environmental, of interdisciplinarity has been fundamental, has permeated all the activities, the program for disease ecology, health and the environment that I launched about 10 years ago, and more recently, the program of disease ecology in a changing world. A second component that I think is very important is the orientation to solutions, of course, and that is again something that in my personal academic experience was previously kept on a side, almost kind of tolerated or allowed, but as a side activities, while this has become a prominent component of the work that we had to do. And so also this orientation to solution forcing us to connect the knowledge between, connect the dots between the knowledge and the possible actionable intervention has been a very important element, especially within the field of using ecological solution to address environmentally mediated infectious disease of humans.
Could you comment on whether you have felt that there was a trade-off between having a solutions orientation and doing the basic science, or whether they have been complementary in your experience?
Well, I have a huge respect for fundamental curiosity-driven research, and there is no doubt that, that is an essential component of our scientific venture in general. I also understand that there are scholars that, prefer to devote their career in that specific field. From my personal upbringing and interest, I've been always, very interested in trying how to move the needle. I was 12 years old the first time that my dad came home with this book, which was The Limit of Growth, that a lot of people here, I'm sure, knows, and that was a topic of conversation for months and months at the dinner table there. And so thinking about that, we need to do something more than knowledge is what has inspired me. And so there is a component of a trade-off of how much time we dedicated in developing these type of solutions. And within the arch of my own career, after having worked on fundamental science in the early phases, I was glad when I moved here at Stanford to find, in the Woods Institute for the Environment in general and in the EVP program, the type of tools that I needed in order to reorient my focus on something that is able to basically develop ecological solution at scale and try, in my specific field, to identify environmental interventions that can improve human health and simultaneously protect the health of the environment that underpins it. It's at the core, basically, of human and planetary health.
Tara, when so often the limiting factors in deployment of environmental policy aren't whether the science that's available, it's working, the relationships between the people and finding a pathway to some kind of a shared understanding. The uncommon dialogue process that you've been deeply involved in aspires to do that. How have you found it work?
Well, first of all, I'm thrilled to be part of this panel because, so thank you for the invitation. And I'm particularly thrilled to be here because, I have such fond memories of my time at the Woods Institute for the Environment. And I'm working on these uncommon dialogues, which we've heard lots about already. And so for people who maybe aren't familiar with uncommon dialogues, the premise behind them is that we think about a really challenging either water or environmental topic that is maybe we see it coming down the road, or we just know that there isn't a clear solution. And what we do is we think about who are the individuals that we need to get together? What's the range of different perspectives that we need to bring together to really have a frank conversation that's really solutions oriented? And so I think that the special part about Uncommon Dialogues is that we're bringing a whole range of different individuals, all experts in their field, but who have a diversity of backgrounds. So everybody from policymakers to technical experts to NGOs through to students, topic experts here at Stanford as well as beyond. And we heard a lot about that earlier, bringing in individuals from outside of Stanford to really work with the experts here to really think about what are those innovative solutions and how might we advance them collectively. And so not only does that sort of build this initial framework for the discussion itself, but then it also builds this network that you can leverage through time. And I think one of the fantastic elements of Uncommon Dialogues is this long tail that comes out of them, where you build You have the dialogue itself, then you have materials that come out of it that sort of summarize some of the findings. But then you also have time to build relationships with individuals who continue to evolve in that space through time. And so I think it's just this holistic approach to really bringing people together to be constructive and really lean into those solutions long term.
It strikes me that in most dialogues like that, people yell at each other and walk out realizing why they hated the other person more than having achieved solutions. But the uncommon dialogues have really been uniquely successful for a number of reasons. I like the way you emphasize trust. I think a second factor that's been important from my understanding is that Stanford's been able to create an environment where people feel safe, and the convening authority and the kind of extra underscoring that comes from being at Stanford. And then I also feel like the emphasis on pragmatism that Stanford conveners have brought historically has maybe bumped people into realizing that the areas of overlap are large relative to the areas of disagreement. And do you want to say a little bit about the consequences of the uncommon dialogues that you participated in on sustainable groundwater?
Sure, yeah. So I was very fortunate to get to attend or be involved in a number of different dialogues throughout my time at Stanford. But I worked with several partners while I was here to design and ultimately host what ended up, we had envisioned it originally as 2 workshops that were going to focus on the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And so we had these dialogues beginning in 2015, right after passage of this historic series of bills that sought to regulate groundwater in California, sort of statewide. And so, it took us 100 years in this state to regulate groundwater after having regulated surface water. And so we knew that there was a lot of consequence to this act. And we saw a real opportunity, both in terms of sort of the expertise, both technical as well as legal, that we had at Stanford. And we also knew that to have effective regulation, we really needed to have some really interdisciplinary discussions about how do we ensure that this very consequential act is implemented successfully. And so we envisioned a workshop series, again, as I mentioned, only 2 workshops initially. And we invited a whole host of different experts to come together and talk about, we started out, let's just talk about some of the challenges and potential solutions in implementing the SIGMA, as it's colloquially referred to. And then we thought, well, we'll do one on data as well, because we were transitioning from an unregulated environment into what will now be a regulated environment. So we knew we were going to need a lot more information and data. And so we thought we'll host these two dialogues. Well, ultimately, it ended up spinning out into 7 dialogues, and they've covered a range of different topics, from data and models to governance structures and coordination to interconnected surface waters. And we're still seeing so many of the outcomes from those dialogues continuing to manifest at this point in time. So that comes out in terms of additional policy innovation that we've seen. So passage of, for example, the Open and Transparent Water Data Act, which was really part of the discussion from those initial workshops where we thought, yeah, we've got this piece of legislation, but we're also realizing that we don't have sufficient data that's publicly accessible to actually make management decisions. And so we saw policy innovations coming out of it. We have so many of the individuals who ultimately attended those initial meetings are now leaders in state agencies, in local agencies that are managing the resource. Here, students who have continued on from those dialogues here at Stanford And then again, all of the relationships that were formed. And so I think that the range of outcomes from those initial dialogues has just been really incredible. And 10 years later, we're still seeing the results. So.
I'm really pleased you ended on this theme of developing participants into leaders. That's exactly what I wanted to talk with Mihana about, who was involved in the First Nations Leadership Institute. And I want to call out the two founders who we both have here, Neil Hannes and Peter Vachusik. And Mihana, tell us about the combination of leadership development and Indigenous empowerment that occurs in First Nations.
So First Nations, which was being planned in 2005 and 2006, and was how many of our people learned about Stanford. And it's an effort to bring together 3 nations, Maori, Native Alaskans, and Native Hawaiians, to come together with Stanford and to learn and to bring our gifts and learning here to this place. Because for us, we think about sustainability in a really long-term way, and we've experienced adaptation in the past. And we're also thinking always about how is the health going to be impacted, how is it going to impact knowledge across generations, and how is it going to impact relationships with place and deepen that. So in terms of leadership development, bringing 95 Hawaiians and 200 fellows total who are already identified leaders in their community, and giving them the time and space to be here at Stanford and to learn from all of you and to be hosted with so much aloha and to follow in the footsteps of Peter, who is so admired by our people and how he's taught what we have to teach, Hawaii as a model ecosystem, and also the layering of social ecosystems and values, and to come together and have really difficult dialogues like you're talking about, super different experiences, because we as a people have always had to innovate, and we're innovating more and more in the face of the kind of climate change you're talking about. And you can't do that unless you can talk to other people who are dealing with the same things. And sometimes people say, we don't want to be leaders. We don't think of ourselves as leaders. Our style of leadership is not to go up front. It's a servant leadership. So to be able to talk about that and also talk about how are you innovating new economic systems for your people, the Maori, in these times, at the same time as are you innovating new ways to bring your children into adulthood that are wrapped in the values of the past. So for us, we're able to be innovative if we're able to wrap it in our values systems. And the people in the fellowship in any given year were called upon to do so many things. This gave us a space and a time to step back and reflect and innovate together.
I think the theme that's coming through from all of your comments is that you don't make the progress you need to make with simply conversations or with simply research or simply leadership, that everybody's spoken about really detailed interplay between the three. Julia, do you want to comment on how you've found engagement and leadership development to be important in the research? And maybe you can mention a couple of results in that context.
Well, absolutely. So, one of the elements that is foundational in the work that we do is, of course, to understand local ecological knowledge. And so the partnership with our collaborators that are currently now, thanks to the foundations that we created with the EVP in Senegal, in Côte d'Ivoire, in Madagascar, and also on the other side of the Atlantic in Brazil, where there's still pocket of these diseases, parasitic diseases that we work on, the schistosomiasis. It's a parasitic disease of poverty that has a complex life cycle that include also freshwater snails as a obligate host. And so the partnership with these collaborators has been fundamental on multiple layers. First of all, in terms of co-sharing of knowledge, and so understanding what are the different perspective that we have on the problem. And also when we have identified solutions, the partnership has been crucially in order to have our collaborators basically becoming leaders on their own on the type of intervention that they feel and they wanted to implement in their own area. A component of the work that I've been doing now has been expanding also through the engineering working group, for instance, of the Global Schistosomiasis Alliance. That is a consortium between academic institutions, governmental bodies, agencies, non-government organizations, and the pharmaceutical industries as well. And within this specific context, it's very important to basically, again, bring together this different set of expertise and identify the directions where we think we are going to achieve the best results in terms of reducing the burden of this specific disease.
Andrew, can you talk a little bit about what you actually do in the Ocean Conservancy and how that either does or doesn't relate to the other themes we're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I work on policy. I work on science policy. There's a lot of ways you can interpret that, but basically I try to bring science and evidence to policy to push for the type of systemic change and action we know that the science says is required. My work specifically focuses on plastics. That's what I studied here at Stanford. I worked a little bit on that when I was in the Senate as well. And so I've been a little bit narrow in that focus, but we have other folks that do the exact same thing on climate, on biodiversity loss, on any number of issues. I work at the state level, federal level, international level. I think one thing that is a theme that I'm hearing kind of throughout our panel, but also throughout the day, that hasn't really come up yet is this idea of science communication. And I think inherent to what the Woods Institute does is it arms students, and likely the faculty members as well, though I can't speak from that perspective, to be able to...
They're a lot harder to help.
So you have students for. To be able to communicate about the science and the import in a way that brings people in, not makes them like holier than thou, which I think is a very cliche idea of academia itself. The science we do here is only as impactful as our ability to tell people about it, make them understand it, and then get buy-in for actual implementation or policy change or systems thinking change. So that's a lot of what I do in terms of the policy. Like, yes, we have the science that says plastic pollution is one of our triple planetary crises. Yes, we know that it's contributing to climate change. A lot of these pieces are well documented. We don't need more evidence there, although it continues to come out, and that's always helpful. But it's talking to people from the place of credibility as a scientist, and then bringing that creative, strategic thinking that we get as engineers and scientists in general to think about how we actually craft policy that can be successful. And I think a lot of the policy work on really echoes the Woods Institute's goal of practical. The worst policy is the one that fails. You can draft the most ambitious thing in the world. If you can't implement it, if it's impractical, who is it helping? And so this idea of kind of a pragmatic approach to progressive policy. And like, I think someone else said it earlier, like we should have been working on this 20 years ago. Instead, we're working on it today. And like, let's not let perfect be the enemy of the good. Let's start working today and then commit to ourselves in these kind of constant communication we have with policymakers or the plastics industry in my case to hold each other accountable to keep chipping away at this.
And when you're trying to identify a counterparty for a new kind of policy action, how do you think about how far away from your position they can be? Do you go to the person who's on the extreme opposite and try and pull them a little closer, or do you go to the person who's your next door neighbor and say, let's work together?
That's a great question. I think there's a role for all of it. Tara, I was thinking about these uncommon dialogues, which I sadly didn't get to experience while I was here, and how familiar it sounds in terms of the type of work that we have to do day in and day out to get something passed. And so I'll give a case study. I helped negotiate and pass this big bill here in California. It's called SB 54. It has a terrible other name. I can't remember it. It's like 4 Ps, like plastic pollution. I don't know. We did a bad job naming it. But it's this really novel approach to tackling plastic pollution that actually drives at the source. So it has a reduction in single-use plastic component. It holds producers financially accountable, so we're getting to this economic incentive, and it gets to environmental justice. It has this polluter pays additional fee for plastic makers that goes back to environmental justice communities in California that have been impacted. To get that done, we sat at a small table that had 20 to 25 people. It included like Dow and ExxonMobil, us from Ocean Conservancy, and everyone in between.
That
and
does sound like an uncommon dialogue.
it was. And I think one thing that I also heard come out in your discussion is this idea of, and probably in both of your work as well, connection before content. And so the idea that we had to get to talk and know each other as people, and understand where we're coming from and why we're coming from different places. Like, oh, you have a fiduciary responsibility to your board. Okay, that sucks. We'll deal with capitalism on another day. But like right now, I understand the framework you're bringing into this conversation better. And so getting to understand the connection with people before you like dive deep into the content makes it so that you can actually have those conversations and try to pull everyone a little bit closer together.
Tara, you mentioned how important the long tail of ongoing activity after a dialogue is. Can you say a little more about how that's worked in the groundwater space?
Sure, yeah, I can talk about it both in the groundwater space and then in some of the other policy work that I've been doing. I think it's important, so in the groundwater space, for example, you know, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was passed, and it had several requirements along the way, but it was a pretty innovative series of bills for a variety of reasons, one of which is it requires individuals to work together at sort of the basin scale and to come together and jointly make decisions. And if they didn't do that, there was a mechanism that the state was going to come in. I see Felicia nodding back there. Mm-hmm. She was instrumental in one of our first dialogues there that we had. And it really has the state coming in if people aren't able to do that in order to provide sort of that backdrop. And so having people come together at the very beginning, it sort of laid a foundation for individuals to, number one, understand what was being required. Number two, start to form the relationships that were necessary. And then to really think about what's going to be required for this to be successful. And because of the sort of rigorous requirements around it, there was recognition that it wasn't going to happen right away, that this was going to take time. And so we were thinking about things at 10 years ago that are now really coming into focus for these individual agencies who need to develop and implement those plans. And so I think a lot of what these early dialogues did was to lay a foundation for that successful implementation, which we're now seeing play out. And again, that was both in terms of thinking about the technical requirements, but also are there any legal requirements or modifications maybe that we need to think about? And then also who do we need to have relationships with? What does that look like? And all of those pieces were sort of components. And again, we're seeing that now.
So maybe the conceptual framework as well as the trust kind of had threads that connected back to the uncommon dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mehana, you're in an unusual position of having one foot in Indigenous cultures and one foot in the formal academic space. And I know that one of the key topics you think about is how those two can support each other and be greater than the sum of the parts. Could you speak to that a little bit?
And I can say I got good mentoring in that here too, because this is a place, Woods has been a place of such good people who are doing your work with your hearts as well as your minds. And at the time that I was here, we were also, learning to be parents and watching how you amazing moms out there were balancing raising your children and bringing them to faculty events and going home and doing trick-or-treating and all the things people are doing this week. So I think that's a big part of it, is the connecting across all of the many layers of who we each are and making space for that. I think our people are innovating so quickly and it's changing so fast. My grandmother passed away my grandmother was born the year Liliuokalani passed away, our queen. When I was a child, there were no options to learn our Hawaiian language in schools. When I came here to Stanford Bookstore, I heard Leahi Hall, who's helping to run First Nations Futures Program, her generation coming out of Hawaiian language immersion schools and speaking it in the bookstore. So I think there were a time of choosing between these roles, and now there's a time of carrying all of those roles and carrying all of those kuleana and how we navigate that and building the partnerships and the relationships. We are always about building relationships with place that are going to last across generations and generations, and building relationships with each other. And you all have made space for that with First Nations and with your work. Welcoming communities, Sybil Diver's a huge part of this, welcoming communities into the university, making it a space, a welcoming space. But so I think that is key, is to create space where people can bring all of themselves, where it can be guided by the land itself, which is why we call out at the start, and all who go before us, and that allows new things to emerge. And I guess I would just say I'm so amazed and I'm so grateful, because now I get to teach students because of all of you and your mentoring, and I try to be a mentor that allows all of who they are to emerge, but also the solutions that they're coming up with and the ways they walk in the world are so amazing to see, and all that you're creating, and that's being created so much younger than us.
Julio, can you speak to the way you've thought about passing on the information that you're acquiring in all the complicated politically and complicated linguistically countries that you're working in, and have engaged local people so they understand the issues and take on the mantle of delivering the kinds of changes that we've seen?
Yeah, we constantly struggle and work, of course, to try to get, as much as involvement, as we can with our collaborators. Language are, of course, barriers, and to some extent, and I think on both sides of the conversation, it's always important to be patient and to try to, understand each other best. I think one element that was saying is creating relationship, as you were mentioning, that I think we all agree, and it's becoming almost a cliche, that the parachute science, it's a sort of a colonial way of doing science and taking and coming back and publishing paper and moving forward. And that type of approach, of course, does not create those long-lasting relationships that will go also, deliver results in the long run, but also allowed to go through cycles of grantings and research monies and stopping for a few years and then starting over again. So spending time together has been crucial, flying and working elbow to elbow, with our collaborators, maybe because I also bring my personal humble Italian culture. I found that it's extremely valuable just to sit around the table and sharing also the different cultural experience in the way we eat, what we eat, and other stuff. And so that I found that as extremely, bonding as an experience and going beyond the classic academic setting. Another element where I believe, and I think it's very important, of course, to pass to the new generation of scientists, of leaders of tomorrow, is also to create an opportunity for training and education. And so in my career in the past and recently as well, especially in collaboration back then with the International Center of Theoretical Physics, I've been working on these sort of schools, like a summer school, which was done in different time of the years. Originally, we were doing that in the headquarters of the ICTP, which is a UNESCO institution in Trieste in Italy, and then we started to work, and we have run these schools, for instance, in Tanzania, in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, and that is an amazing opportunity to spend in several weeks, if possible, elbow to elbow with this new generation of really enthusiastic young scientists that are eager to learn and to work together. And so that has been also something that I think probably we need, when we think about the School of Sustainability and the Wood, we need to invest more time and resources in the future in order to get a little bit out of the ivory tower of the Stanford academia, which is absolutely allows us to do all these kind of things, but really, traveling more and opening our mind to problems that we, have never thought even before. And so I wanted to say that in addition to, I think, some really significant scientific results that we obtain with the group of people I work, and some really cool scientific paper, at the end of the day, what really make me happier thinking about the human relationship, the new ties and bridges that I've built, which part of the world when I moved here to Stanford, I didn't even know, that I could relate with. And so it's been an incredible warming experience.
That's a great uplifting tone to transition to a few minutes for questions. We have 10 minutes for questions from the audience. Thank you, Molly, for the time check. And we'd love to hear from all of you. Well, while you're thinking, now I see two questions. Just while you were thinking, two people came up with questions. Go ahead, Sybil.
Thank you to the illustrious panel of colleagues and friends and folks I look up to. My name is Sybil Diver. I do a lot of work here in environmental justice and also sort of thinking about collective efforts by which we find solutions and also invite others to come in and help us get better definitions of, what's the problem even? And I'm curious about, your experience with culture building and, how you in your work create a culture that invites, open-minded engagement with these really hard problems, and what you're bringing from, your experience at Woods and Stanford and what you've learned along the way about culture building that allows for, this really important solutions work to happen in a good way. Thank you.
Who would like to start with that?
I can.
Okay, please, Mahana.
I think that one of the things that's key for me is helping people to connect, and all the things you said, that you create that space. Also creating opportunities to listen, whether that's to the land itself. I am really grateful to have students go and work with community groups. And so when I came to Stanford, I was a young person working and teaching in a community group where we were restoring land, mountain to sea, restoring waterways as a way really to create food for our people and traditional foods, and bringing elders and youth together to create those. And when FNFP was being created, and that brought me to Stanford, it forced us to think about what those systems do, what those community groups actually do, how they create resilience when there's a flood, how they create all of the value they create. So in terms of the collaboration building, one of the things I see is sending people out and being in place together, and these spaces where there are community groups, because not all of our solutions can be government, and not all of our solutions can be private ownership. Those are both really important roles. Government has to put bumpers so things can happen. But a lot of it also has to happen among people who interact with a place together over time, whether that's Hopkins and what that's developed, or people who get to know a place so they can see how it's changing and see those corals changing and interacting over time. So that's a way I try to build collaboration, is bring people together in places that they love so that they can talk about the changes, so they can talk about how they're going to respond to them. And then putting those who are doing that work in leadership roles in the teaching and in the mentoring and in the problem solving and decision making. And we've gone from that one group I told you about in Hawaii. There were about 50 in the 1990s when I was working there. And then every decade we've had another 80 emerge. And a lot of those are started by students, former students at Stanford, fellows on this program, people who've gone out and seen a need and went and started a new space, a new honua for, adapting to climate and for creating resilient food and all of those things, and for teaching. And it just grows and grows, because if you do the collaboration well, then one group will hand off to another group. And then instead of just scaling up, we're rooting down and reaching out in ways that are really, really strong. But it all kind of starts with, being in place and caring about and seeing these things together.
Andrew, we probably don't often think about the hard-boiled policy world as having a culture, but do you want to speak to how you think about that?
Yeah, it has a culture, not always great. See me after. I think what sticks with me is probably something that is less specific to Woods and more just like what we all do together here, both in the Woods Institute, but also just science. And we probably take it for granted, but leading from a place of curiosity, it's so much easier to say no. And you say no from a place of, I don't understand or I'm scared. And in a super divisive time from, everything about the environment and the environmental issues we're talking about, just speaking up and asking like, oh, why? Like, why do you think that? And that was something that really struck me when I was working in the Senate, was so many of the people I had meetings with, because we met with everyone, were just not used to someone asking a follow-up question, like a single follow-up question. And so just really back to the point of like how we like educate and bring, get the supply of people we need, building the confidence in students to ask that question. And that comes back to that place of like trust and safety, of like being confident enough in your own intellectual curiosity and standing in the world to say like, hey, I don't understand that word you're using. Could you explain the jargon you're trying to hide behind right now? Or why is that the approach you're taking? Or why is that like how you're tackling these issues? And so just coming at things from a place of curiosity, I think would make us all better people, but also would help move this policy a lot, or move the conversation forward.
I think we have time for one more question, and I saw one over here. Amy, did you have a question? Yeah.
Thanks. Great discussion. I love the parallels from what's happening in academia and outside, and the need for moving around cultures and disciplines. And you were getting this last point, but it's uncommon dialogues, uncommon language, uncommon mindsets that I think is coming out, worldviews. And I just wonder, having been someone who's gone through different cultures and different sectors and really being still shocked every time I do, thinking, oh, they don't really understand me at all. And I just wonder how, from an institution and as you're teaching, at the Woods Institute, as you think about teaching people going out into these interdisciplinary worlds to get those uncommon dialects, are there ways to, besides bringing them into these dialogues, are there ways that you're experimenting in how you can prepare that moving through and different worldviews and how different it can be? I think in an academic institution, even, we talk about cross-disciplinaries. You can sit with a biologist and a chemist, and that's a challenge sometimes. But when you're talking with someone from Shell and someone from a nature program who doesn't even, the conversation is just so different. I'm in conversations a lot where someone thinks biodiversity and carbon are the same word. And how do you prepare people for those kind of dialogues? Because we don't have time for them to have another 2 decades to be able to catch up.
Yeah, Tara, do you want to speak to that? We only have a minute or so left.
I think these
yeah,
still work.
right.
More time than it deserves. No.
No, I mean, such a great question. And I think part of what is fantastic about the Woods Institute for the Environment and the work that's being done here is, one, training people how to set up those conversations, and really provide a framework about, the vocabulary, the definitions, and the structures to be able to have those conversations. And then also to be able to have a space where you can say, I don't understand, and feel safe enough to do that, similar to what you were saying, Anya. And so I think it's challenging, but I think part of what we've learned here today is just how valuable it is to continue to strive towards, continuing to do that, because it's the only way we can answer these really challenging questions. So, yeah.
You want to jump in
One
really
thing, really
micro
quickly.
response?
It is related to my path at RELP, but is also, I took the most amazing class with someone who is a Woods Institute fellow, Steve Luby, in the School of Medicine. And he taught this class called Theories of Change. And it makes you think about your theory of change, but also your way of thinking. And I feel like that's something you were getting at a lot, is like actually calling out your way of thinking about a problem and the solution, like your way of thinking about a solution, and like forcing folks to have that meta conversation before you get into these spaces, I think would be really helpful in understanding, oh, I'm a technologist. That's my theory of change. I'm gonna wanna build out a system for this. I need government funding to do that. Let me go find the public policy theory of change person. So I think creating spaces in the Woods Institute to have those types of classes that bring people environmental engineering and med students together is wildly unique.
Well, thank you, Julio, Mehana, Tara, and Anja for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.